welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes the most massive revolutions in an entire industry, they don't start with a giant corporate mandate or a billion-dollar budget.
Yeah, they really don't.
Sometimes they just start with a few stapled pages sitting on a folding table in a dimly lit room. Today's journey is absolutely perfect for you if you love unpacking how seemingly niche, hyper-specific topics completely change the trajectory of modern entertainment.
Oh, it's such a great topic today.
Right. We are looking at an exhaustive archival dossier on this unassuming 8-page booklet published in the summer of 1978. It's a tabletop role-playing adventure called Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl, or to the people who played it, simply Module G2.
Gary Gygax, right?
Exactly, the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons. But our mission today isn't just to recount the plot of a vintage game. We are taking this source material and exploring a massive paradigm shift in game design. We're looking at the invention of environmental storytelling and quite literally the birth of shared serialized communal entertainment.
Which is a huge claim. But to really grasp the impact of what we're looking at, we need to completely change our mental backdrop. I want you to picture a classic wood-paneled 1970s basement.
Oh, yeah, the heavy shag carpet.
Right, imagine the heavy shag carpet beneath your feet, a card table scattered with weird polyhedral dice, smudged sheets of graph paper, and maybe a few cans of off-brand soda. In 1978, the company behind D&D TSR Hobbies was standing at this critical precipice.
They were in transition.
Exactly. They were in the agonizing process of transforming from a localized Midwestern wargaming club into a global publishing powerhouse. Because before this exact moment in time, the concept of an official published adventure, it basically didn't exist for consumers.
It was all do-it-yourself.
Yeah. The game manuals you could buy were essentially toolkits, just a box of mechanical parts for you to build your own campaigns from scratch. But this specific 8-page booklet, Module G2, acting as the bridge in a 3-part tournament series, it became the fulcrum of an industry-wide change.
Okay, let's unpack this, because of the very premise of G2 completely shatters the expectations of anyone sitting down to play. According to the dossier, this was designed as a high-level adventure meant for characters between levels 9 and 12.
Which is huge for that era.
Right. For those of you who might not know the progression scale of the time, by the time your character hits those levels, you are basically a demigod. You are flying over obstacles, casting massive spells, shrugging off sword blows, and generally feeling like an untouchable superhero.
You're the apex predator, basically.
But G2 introduces this brutal wilderness dungeon hybrid where the environment itself is the ultimate antagonist. It is entirely unforgiving. And looking at the mechanics here, they strip away that power fantasy incredibly fast.
What's fascinating here is how the design practically demanded a complete tactical reset from the players. High-level players were heavily conditioned to just bulldoze their way through subterranean corridors.
Yeah.
But Gygax placed this adventure in a howling, three-dimensional glacial gorge, where the physical topography mathematically punished arrogance.
Punished is almost an understatement. I mean, I'm looking at the specific probability charts in the module, and they are gleefully brutal. For instance, if you are walking along the icy upper ledges of this rift, every single character has a base 1 in 6 chance of slipping.
Which sounds low, but it really isn't.
And if you think, oh, that's fine, we'll just be smart and rope ourselves together for safety, well, the rules anticipate that. If one person fails that check, there is a massive mathematical risk that they drag the entire roped party down a 150-foot drop into the bottom of the rift.
It's just immediate doom, a total party wipe from one bad step.
And it gets worse if you go into the misty interior caverns. The chance of slipping increases to 2 in 6. And if you fall, you automatically drop whatever weapons you are holding.
Which is bad enough on its own.
But wait, plus, if you drop an item on the uneven glacial floor, the module dictates a 1 in 4 chance that it slides into a deep fissure and is lost forever. You could lose a legendary campaign-defining magic sword simply because you stumbled in the fog.
Unbelievable. And even the doors hate you in this place.
Yes, the boulder doors.
Right. The giants use massive boulders to seal their rooms. If you have a mathematically peaked character, an 18 strength, which is essentially Olympic weightlifter levels of power, you only have a 2 in 6 chance of moving it.
Which brings us to a concept called heuristic design. For you listening, heuristic design simply means the game forces you to learn its rules and boundaries through painful trial and error.
You couldn't just rely on the numbers written on your character sheet anymore. You had to fundamentally change your physical approach to problem solving within the fiction of the world.
Huh.
And nowhere in this dossier is that clearer than in how the module handles magic.
Oh, the magic. In high-level play, arcane spellcasters are essentially walking artillery.
Right, they rely on devastating area of effect spells magic that blows up an entire room rather than targeting a single creature.
The melting ice mechanic, I was reading through the encounter notes, and this is perhaps the most controversial yet brilliant mechanic in the whole booklet. It specifically penalizes that arcane supremacy you're talking about.
That really does.
There is a specific encounter deep in the caves where a fearsome creature is guarding a highly coveted ring of 3 wishes. Now, if you were playing a high-level wizard, your immediate reflex is to cast Fireball or Lightning Bolt to clear the threat.
Of course, that's your bread and butter.
But if you do that in this specific ecosystem, the intense thermal energy rapidly melts the ancient glacial ice. Suddenly, the cavern fills with blinding steam and hazardous pools of freezing water. But crucially, you melt the ice, holding the priceless treasure itself, and the ring gets washed away into the subterranean runoff forever.
Taking that a step further, historians still heavily debate the intent behind that specific design choice. Is this a brilliant implementation of verisimilitude, meaning it makes the fantasy world feel logically real and believable? Or is it just antagonistic dungeon master versus player design meant specifically to weaken or nerf wizards?
Right, modern sensibilities might lean toward calling it unfair.
Exactly. But in 1978, it heuristically demanded tactical restraint. It forced you, the player, to stop spamming your most damaging spells and instead think creatively. You had to use subtle, utility, magic, crowd control, or targeted illusions. You had to outthink the dungeon, not just outblast it.
And you had to outthink it while navigating what the notes describe as sandbox in miniature. We have to remember, this is only an 8-page booklet. Yet it contains 51 distinct keyed rooms, and an overwhelming 35 of them contain hostile monsters.
The sheer density of threats is staggering. But it goes even further than just density. It's what designers call a living dungeon.
Right, because things don't just stand still.
Exactly. If you're used to modern video games, you often see monsters just standing around in a room locked in stasis, waiting to be provoked or aggroed by the player. But the text of G2 explicitly instructed the person running the game that if the players retreated, which they inevitably had to given the sheer lethality we just discussed, the giants would respond dynamically.
They wouldn't just wait for the heroes to return.
No, they would fortify the boulder doors, set lethal ambushes, and consolidate their defenses. It completely invalidated the standard strategy of kicking down a door, fighting, and resting. It forced a hit-and-run guerrilla warfare approach.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that living dungeon concept stems from a specific philosophy that was brewing at the time known as Gygaxian Naturalism.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
The idea was that dungeons shouldn't just be fun houses with random traps and monsters tossed into a blender. There should be pseudo-scientific ecosystems. When you look at the taxonomy of the creatures living in the Jarl's domain, it's not random.
Right, it's not just a grab bag of cold monsters.
You have polar bears, winter wolves, and yelamies. But you also have giantesses, giant children, indentured servants, and slaves. It makes the Glacial Rift a functioning, breathing society. It has its own economy, its own domestic disputes, its own biological logic.
It is a fascinating attempt at world building, though the dossier points out several inherent contradictions in that logic. This is where the tension between biological realism and gamified combat really shows its seams.
Like the Remmer has.
Exactly. For our listener, a Remhares is essentially a massive armor-plated centipede that generates the internal heat of a blast furnace. He also included a corrosive, mindless ooze called a white pudding. If you think about it ecologically, how do these creatures exist in adjacent icy caves without completely destroying the carefully balanced society of the frost giants?
They would literally melt everything.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't make biological sense. They are placed there simply as terrifying mechanical obstacles draped in a cold aesthetic to drain the player's resources.
And that tension between the deep lore and the actual rules created some hilarious textual fossils, too. Because this module was written in 1978, it sat right in the middle of this weird transitional phase between the original rules and the highly codified advanced rules that were about to come out.
It's a snapshot of an evolving game.
Yeah, I found an obscure piece of trivia in the dossier regarding a piece of loot hidden in the rift. The Sword of Giant Slaying. The text explicitly lists the sword's alignment as neutral good, but then specifically notes that the sword has no special intelligence or ego.
Which is a massive rule fossil frozen in time. Under the original Lusa rule set, Any magic sword could just arbitrarily have a moral alignment, like being good or evil.
Just automatically.
Right. But the later finalized advance rules strictly dictated that a sword could only possess a moral alignment if it was highly intelligent and sentient. So finding a dumb but morally good sword in Module G2 is like finding a weird evolutionary dead end captured perfectly in the amber of this printing.
Speaking of things captured in amber, or rather captured in solid ice, we have to talk about the visual aesthetic and the physical art of the module itself.
Yes, I want you to imagine opening this physical booklet and suddenly you're blinded by a sea of monochromatic light blue ink. This was the infamous blue map drafting style by artist David C. Sutherland III.
Which was so innovative for the time.
The physical production of G2 was incredibly innovative. It featured a heavy stock detached cover with the maps printed directly on the inside. This allowed the person running the game to stand the cover upright on the table, using it as a rudimentary screen to hide their dice rolls while constantly referencing the map.
It was a brilliant usability feature. But that blue ink, let's just say it was problematic.
To say the least.
With all the complex, overlapping topological lines needed to show the multi-tiered vertical ledges of the rift, that monochromatic blue turned into an absolute confusing blur. Especially if you were trying to read it in that dimly lit 1970s basement we talked about.
It was a headache waiting to happen.
But the actual character art that accompanied it, specifically the work by Dave A. Trampier, was iconic. He basically set the visual canon for the era with these intricate woodcut-inspired ink drawings, although he did take some bizarre, completely unregulated artistic liberties.
He certainly did. If you look at his illustration of the Remorhaz, that massive heat-generating insectoid monstrosity we just discussed, he gave it a distinct, prominent mustache.
A handlebar mustache on a giant subterranean centipede monster. It perfectly captures that Wild West era of early game publishing. There were no strict corporate brand guidelines or massive art departments. The artists were just throwing in eccentric personal flair.
You also see it in the Jarl's Trophy Room, which features the teeth and claws of an Umber Hulk, which, for the uninitiated, is a terrifying underground horror with massive mandibles. It was a subtle, scary nod to the deep earth threats that awaited players.
And speaking of scary, we have to talk about the frozen victims.
The macabre taxonomy of failed adventurers.
Yes, scattered throughout the ice caves are these massive blocks of ice containing the frozen remains of previous heroes who failed to defeat the giants. It serves as this incredibly grim environmental warning to you, the player.
And it also holds tantalizing loot, right?
Exactly. If you can figure out how to extract the bodies without melting everything and ruining it, like with the ring we mentioned earlier, the dossier lists them out. You have a dwarf frozen with a spilled pouch of 37 gems. You have an elf entombed with a highly valuable staff of frost. A human with a jeweled belt worth 1,000 gold pieces.
All great treasures.
And my absolute favorite piece of dark comedy in the entire module, a human adventurer frozen completely solid who is wearing a ring of resistance to fire.
It's a wonderful dark joke baked right into the environment. If you are a player at that table, discovering that ironic detail tells you exactly what kind of ruthless world you've stepped into.
It's hilarious to think about that guy frozen with his fire resistance ring. But what's really crazy is that all of this intricate detail, the macabre jokes, the ruthless ecosystem, the living dungeon mechanics, it was all dreamed up in an absolute state of panic.
The crunch period for this module was insane.
Gary Gygax and his editor Tim Kask wrote this module, along with the ones before and after it, in a 7 to 8 day window. They desperately needed them ready for a massive competitive tournament at the Origins 78 gaming convention.
Gygax was exhausted from writing the massive technical rulebooks and just wanted to create something purely adventurous. He leaned heavily into Norse mythology, taking the title Jarl and the concept of primordial ice giants directly from a 1941 fantasy novella called The Roaring Trumpet.
And because it was designed specifically for a high-stakes tournament, the extreme lethality wasn't a flaw, it was the entire point. It was a deliberate mechanical filter to test tactical acumen under pressure.
The dossier details how Gygax actually playtested this with his core group to make sure it functioned. Rob Kuntz ran his famous fighter character Robilar and only survived by using a retinue of disposable orc hirelings to absorb the giant's massive melee attacks.
Talk about ruthless tactics.
And Jim Ward specifically rolled up a thief named Ren of the Blade just to test if stealth and trap finding could even physically function in that unforgiving, icy environment.
And when TSR eventually published all these tournament modules together a few years later, they actually included the pre-generated character sheets that the convention players use.
Which is where we get those amazing names.
Yes, the TSR staff members who were assigned the tedious job of making these characters got their passive-aggressive revenge by giving them the most legendary, nonsensical names in role-playing history. You have Gleepwerp the Eye-Biter, the Wizard, Cloyer Bolts the Magsman the Thief, and the elf fighter mage Fonkin Speak.
Imagine sitting down at a serious tournament trying to survive a brutal glacial apocalypse, and your character's name is Fonkin Speak.
It's just so perfect.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, though, the tournament origins and the funny names actually mask something profoundly important about this 8-page booklet. On the surface, Module G2 looks like a straightforward, localized giant hunting mission, a punitive expedition into the ice.
But deep within the rift, hidden away from the main path, is a massive cosmic twist.
The Obsidian Box. I was hoping we'd get to this.
Astute players who survived the deepest, most lethal reaches of the caverns would find collapsed tunnels and an alien obsidian box. Inside is a weird chain made of black metal accompanied by cryptic instructions written on human skin.
This wasn't just a random piece of dark fantasy flavor thrown in to scare the players. It was the crucial link in a serialized narrative.
Right. According to the notes, this was the secret machination of a rogue drow priestess named Eklavdro, who was serving a chaotic cosmic entity known as the Elder Elemental God.
The magic black chain found in the preceding hill giant module physically transported you to this Frost Giant module, and the events here pushed you physically down into the volcanic depths of the subsequent Fire Giant module.
This was the invention of the adventure path. It proved that a localized terrestrial threat could slowly peel back to reveal a massive subterranean cosmic conspiracy.
And that concept completely revolutionized the publishing model for the tabletop industry. Before this, everyone was playing in their own isolated, disconnected basement worlds. The idea of the adventure path proved that a shared, serialized narrative could unite a global player base.
Suddenly, you had players in London, Sydney, and Chicago all talking about how they survived the exact same icy ledges or debating what they did when they found the black chain.
It created a shared cultural touchstone, a collective memory for an entire generation of gamers.
Which is exactly why collectors today go absolutely crazy trying to find the second printing variant of this module. It's the one with the specific black star icon on the cover that proves it was an official Origin 78 tournament module. It's a physical relic of the exact moment the industry fundamentally changed. So what does this all mean for you listening to this today? Why should we care about some dusty 1978 gaming supplement?
It's a fair question.
It means that an 8-page booklet wasn't just a game. It was a masterclass in heuristic design. It taught an entire generation of players to outthink their problems rather than just outmuscle them. It proved that an environment could be a character and an antagonist in its own right.
And most importantly, it established the foundational architecture for the modern serialized storytelling that every major role-playing publisher and really many broader entertainment franchises still heavily relies on today.
Exactly.
But I'd like to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder on that, friend.
Yeah.
We spent this time dissecting how this environment was built on Gygaxian naturalism, treating a fantasy world with rigorous pseudoscientific logic. But what happens when we apply that same ruthless evolutionary lens to the heroes themselves?
Oh, that's an interesting flip.
In a truly naturalistic world, perhaps the adventurers aren't the protagonists at all. Maybe they are merely an invasive species entering a balanced ecosystem, and they are destined to be violently expelled by that environment.
That is a brilliant and slightly terrifying thought to chew on. The adventurers as the invasive species. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking for those hidden artifacts, and we'll catch you next time.